each. So we're going to get started with Mark, who is our specialty crops specialist, which is a really special position. So Mark, take it away with that, and we can see your slides on the screen, and so I'm going to let you go.
Thanks for that introduction, Perry, and
yes.
Thanks for the opportunity to present and for to the Nature Conservancy for setting up the webinar. I have a few slides, and over the next 10 or 15 minutes, I'd like to kind of, I'll show you the arc of what we'll be talking about. But the title is Crop Shifting for Water Savings, or Water Conservation, and just starting the conversation. I want to make sure that I frame it that way, that these are just some ideas, and we'll probably throw out more questions than answers at this point, but it's to kind of conceptualize what we're talking about. And as Perry mentioned, I'm an assistant professor of horticulture and specialty crops at Colorado State University. Next slide, please. So as a brief overview of what we'll be talking about, I want to give just a little bit of background briefly and introduce myself to the group. We'll go through what is a specialty crop, some thoughts on water and differences between different crops, and then this concept of shifting and possibly other strategies. I'll show some pictures of what that can look like for reducing consumptive use, and Perry alluded to a couple of these. Next slide, please. So this slide should have some text, and then a few pictures will overlay in just a minute, but just to give a little bit of background, I'm originally from Illinois, a rain-fed agricultural system. I did my degrees there. And then I moved out west. I moved to New Mexico State University in southern New Mexico. It's Las Cruces, New Mexico, for those who might be interested. And was there for the past 8 years working with pungent vegetable crops. Vegetable crops really are my background. Onions, mustards, chili peppers, and more. And recently in January of this year moved to Colorado State University for a specialty crops position. My past research work was with horseradish and, again, other pungent crops. If you advance, there should be a picture of chili peppers that pops up. And if we advance again, another picture of vegetables. But really, that's where I'm coming from. That's my background. And there's a little bit about the specialty crops program. I won't spend too much time on that, the program itself, but I did want to introduce the concept because the position's been empty for a couple of years. And so there should be a what is specialty crop text slide next. And so I pulled this right from the USDA Ag Marketing Service. So it's a direct quote, but I'll read through it. Fruits and vegetables, tree nuts, dried fruits, horticulture, and nursery crops, including floriculture. Eligible plants should be cultivated or managed. In other words, not necessarily wild collected types of plants. For medicinal purposes or aesthetic gratification, to be considered a specialty crop. Many of them are high value, and many of them, like vegetables, for example, are fairly high value when you compare it to an agronomic crop, for example. Important point here, though, is that some are lower water use, but definitely not all, and that's where a lot of the work and the questions can arise, but I'll give you a specific example in a couple of minutes. So next slide, please. Here's a picture from New Mexico, and it's a vegetable flood irrigated field, and I just have this one up there on some smiling student faces. And kind of posing the question, are, for example, vegetable crops, which are considered to be a specialty crop, are they in fact low water use? We'll see a couple graphics in a little while, but in arid regions, especially under a flood irrigated system, we might be using 1 to 2 inches a week. And so depending on what you're currently growing, that may be a lot, that may be a little, but just to give some context, and I'll give a comparison in a couple of slides. So next slide, please. It should say example at the top. If we think about beans, so my realm is vegetable crops, so fresh snap beans would be an example of a specific vegetable. A dry bean that's edible, like pintos, those two are probably pretty familiar. And a third type of bean that's probably not as familiar to most people. There's a picture of a nice bowl full of tepary beans down below. They're a little smaller than a pinto, and they taste pretty similar to a pinto, maybe a little bit more earthy. Very nice, very interesting crop. All three of those are specialty crops, but they definitely, and Becca can speak to this more, but they definitely have different markets and different values, or a market may not even exist for tepary, for example. And they have pretty dramatically different water uses. Those fresh snap beans might take approximately 36 inches of irrigation water, not all at once, of course, but throughout the course of the growing season to not only bring that crop to production, but then keep it in production for a period of time as well. So if you envision an acre foot, this would be about 3 acre feet to get that first crop off. Pintos can be a little bit lower. Again, depends on very much on your production system and your irrigation type. But pintos could be closer to 22 inches as a comparison to that first one. And tepary is a really interesting and exciting one. It's a native to the southwestern United States and can grow and produce a crop on 8 to 12 inches of rain that it would normally get in parts of Arizona where it's native to during their monsoon season right about this time of year. So again, very different water uses, and probably on the lowest end is that tepary. From a production standpoint, these may require different equipment. There may be some equipment overlap, and certainly production considerations are going to be different from crop to crop, and how they're handled post-harvest, a dry bean that needs to be shelled versus a fresh snap bean that needs to be refrigerated. Those are all quite different from each other. So just one example. We'll go to the next slide. I debated putting this one in, but I just wanted to give a little bit of perspective and look at water in a kind of a different way. But this is a graphic produced by the Los Angeles Times using various data sets, and I thought it was interesting to look at the lower right-hand corner of that graphic, and you see the fruits and vegetables. This is gallons of water per ounce of food to produce those various crops. Some, like lettuce, are very short turnaround crop, but they're made up almost entirely of water. But because they're not in the field for very long, they're a good example of a pretty low number of gallons per ounce of food to produce those. So I just want to pop that up for a little while. Again, this is recorded, I believe, so if you wanted to take a closer look, I do have the link posted below. So let's shift, next slide please, to crop shifting and other possible strategies. I wanted to kind of put that into words. So one possibility is to shift to a lower water use specialty crop, to lower consumptive use. So an example that we've already gone over was the tepary, or a short season crop. I mentioned lettuce, but radish, for example, as a specialty crop is in the ground for a very short period of time. It could be as low as 30 days. You can modify production approaches, and this is something that Perry alluded to, and I'll show you some pictures toward the end of tillage management, residue management, and possibly even controlled environment, kind of concentrated management in order to reduce the amount of water that's being used. So I'll go through a couple of examples, but there's definitely a lot of work and research that can be done here. So I'll flip through these next ones a little bit rapidly. Project I was involved with High Tunnels was combining a specialty crop in the winter, which is a lower evapotranspiration time of year, and in a covered structure like a high tunnel, can all be ways that we can reduce the water use, but still produce a high quality and highly marketable crop. Next slide, please. Here are a few shots of just other thoughts and strategies. These can be combined, organic transition. This is a shot of a cover crop field, and even incorporating vegetables and specialty crops into those types of systems. Next slide, please. That can include using different pieces of equipment like a roller crimper pictured here. And on the next slide, you can see the effect of rolling down a cover crop like that for water conservation purposes and leaving it in place. If you flip to the next slide, we'll have a couple of pictures of a tractor pulling through and performing strip tillage. And if we click again, you can see what that strip tillage looks like in the field and in that field of rolled cover crop. And finally, if with another click, there should be a picture of Swiss chard planted into those reduced tillage plots. So again, combining a specialty crop, a vegetable crop, into a reduced tillage situation can go toward the direction of reduced consumptive water use. The next slide should be a quick picture of some other vegetable crops, and this one's in a no-till situation with the residue left in place. This is no-till peppers in Arizona, and some corn in the background there. And so those are just a few verbal as well as pictorial examples of how we can kind of come at this question and where some additional work needs to be done. So moving from that no-till peppers picture is the last slide that I have, which is a mugshot of myself and our specialty crops program assistant, Natalie Yoder, and our contact information. And be happy to field questions either after the call or however the moderators would like to handle that. Thanks very much.
Yeah, this is Aaron, Mark. I think since you have to leave, if there are a couple quick questions for Mark that we want to address, let's go ahead and do that now. Otherwise, I can follow up with him by email if there are questions later. But any quick questions for Mark?
Aaron, I put a couple up.
Yeah, go ahead, Perry.
Mark, when you were talking about your water application or water rates, is that consumed water or applied water?
Almost always it's been applied water.
Okay.
Haven't taken that next step, but this certainly would be a very interesting next step, next project kind of question.
Yeah, I mean, do we know a lot, or I guess what literature thread would you recommend that would kind of help us categorize the quantities of water used by specialty crops or, popular specialty crops?
It's much more difficult to find than you might think, both because specialty crops are such a diverse list. It's a huge number. In some cases, the work has not been done, has not been quantified. And in some cases, it's been done, but under very specific conditions in the East, for example, that would be different from Colorado. And I've still yet to run across a comprehensive resource that summarizes all of them under a certain condition, a certain set of conditions. So I'm still searching for that, but you can find individual crop by crop comparisons, but that comprehensive list is a little bit of the holy grail for me.
Yeah, I mean,
when they something we can work on.
Yeah, I was thinking some lysimetry work could be done with some simple sort of monoliths and load cells and that sort of stuff. But when the LA Times puts out this number of gallons of water used, I just wonder. I'm never totally clear. Maybe someone else on the call knows. Like, where do they get that information from? I don't know when they say used if that even means applied or consumed.
Right, and often those are fairly simplified types of graphics. I debated putting it in or not, but it does kind of give a nice visual and has some value. But they do give their methodology for putting those that graphic together at that link that's embedded in that web in that slide. But those are all very good questions, and we'd have to address up front which one is most important to us as a group or to stakeholders.
Yeah, I would think some simple lysimetry work could be done that would enable us to get a handle on some of these CU rates. And then the other quick question I have is for the no-till. Is it just a cover crop prior to the planting, and then you just mow it down and leave the residue?
In that strip tillage example?
The no-till example you had, where I didn't know what the crop was in there, but
it was a previous crop of, in that case, I believe a wheat, but it was a cereal of some sort.
A wheat.
Right,
okay.
And so there was the benefit there of the product was still harvested, but the residue was left on the surface.
Yeah. Okay.
But it brings up questions of no-till equipment and things like that might be a bottleneck.
And wheat is a good rotational crop for like a switch. Any other good options that you'd recommend?
A lot of the cereals are a good choice for a lot of reasons, because often you're going in with a dicot after that monocot cereal. But it depends on what your exact needs are. But if you're talking water conservation, a lot of the grasses and cereals are a good choice.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we had an interesting cover crop discussion a while back where Joel Schneeklopp, he kind of contrasts the value of cover crops from a transpiration perspective. Many cover crops work well in wet areas, but then when you get into drier areas, you stand sometimes a better chance of reducing water consumption by reducing evaporation. In other words, keeping a cover crop on the field with something that has no consumptive use. But that's that's why the no-till question kind of piqued my interest.
Sure.
Any other folks want to jump in before we get to Becca?
I have a question. This is Margaret Bowman. I had a question about the marketing of the specialty crops. Has anyone done any studies about market availability for these crops, or is anyone looking at this, either from an academic or a practical standpoint?
Hey, Margaret, can we hold that question until Becca's next talk is literally all about that question?
Oh, fabulous. Sorry to bother them.
Yeah.
Yeah, why don't we go ahead and get started, Becca, if you want to take it away. And thanks, Mark. Appreciate the setup, and let's shift to a bit more of the market analysis.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Aaron and Perry, for hosting today's webinar. I'm happy to be here. So Mark and I actually started at Colorado State University at the same time. I started last January, and I'm in the Department of Agricultural and Resource Economics. And I'm an assistant professor, and I also have an extension position. I do work in food systems. I'm a food systems economist. And so basically, my job is to support, I do a lot of work with specialty crop producers, but really with all commodities, trying to help identify different kinds of market opportunities or to help with evaluating those different marketing strategies. So what is going to enhance the profitability of your operation? Also do a lot of work with small, mid-scale, and beginning farmers and thinking about opportunities for rural and regional economic development. So I want to be clear at the onset here that I am not a water expert in my department. Right down the hall, we do have a number of regional economists that are experts in allocating, water use and water efficiency and doing modeling around that. That is not the work I do. But I thought what I would do today is talk about some things that I would recommend anybody consider before transitioning or purchasing a new operation, thinking about, cultivating some land you have. So, really, what do you want to consider before you start? And, of course, thinking about what is suitable to grow on the land that you have available is really important. And, of course, that's what Mark does and some of the work he does. But where I usually start being, an ag economist is really with where's our market opportunity? So where does your farm or ranch have a comparative advantage to access certain kinds of markets? And so hopefully you'll have a better understanding of what I mean by the end of today's presentation. So what we're going to do for the remainder of our time is to look at some market trends around specialty crops. We're going to look at some opportunities for differentiation. And then we're going to look at some preliminary research that looks at the sort of profitability or farm viability impacts of different kinds of market channels that you might utilize. So going into some market trends, I really don't want to spend a lot of time thinking about ag exports, but I wanted everybody on the call to understand that about 25% of total exports in 2015 were of U.S. horticultural exports. So this is really important because, of course, export markets are a huge market for horticulture, especially crop products. And, we do have a trade surplus in this country, so that's important to note. We did see a small drop in U.S. ag exports in 2015, but in general, we have growing demand for these products. So thinking about export markets at the onset is certainly not a bad thing to do. However, there are some challenges in accessing some of these markets. And I don't want to go into some specifics, but I wanted you to see from this slide that each of our trade partners has different kinds of restrictions and regulations. And in addition to that, you also have to have different kinds of certification to access different kinds of markets. So accessing these export markets really requires a whole other set of thinking in terms of, what you're going to have to do to be able to access those markets. So for the rest of the time today, we're really going to focus on domestic markets, but I didn't want to lose track of the fact that thinking about those export markets are a viable option for many people, but that there are additional things to consider. So in terms of the U.S. domestic markets, the share of U.S. household consumer expenditures on food is about 13%. This has stayed pretty constant for the past several years. However, we as Americans used to spend a larger percentage, a larger share of our household expenditures on food. So this has declined, but now staying relatively constant. And what's interesting now is that basically for the first time, we now spend about half of our expenditures on food away from home and half them at home. So at home would be something like you go purchase food from a grocery store that you're going to cook in your house to consume at home. Away from home would be more things like restaurants. And so it's interesting now that we have this 50-50 split. Total spending in 2014 was $1.46 trillion, so quite a substantial amount of money. In terms of that share of at-home food expenditures, by far and away, most money is spent at supermarkets. And I wanted to highlight this because I do a lot looking at these alternative markets, so at some of these local and regional food markets, farmers markets, farm to institutional sales, and I'm going to talk about some of those trends. But I really want to hammer home here the point that most food is marketed through these supermarkets. So if you access some of these, direct-to-consumer markets, the overall expenditure of those markets is relatively small compared to a grocery store. And so even though there are some opportunities, especially for new beginning small farms or farms that are looking to differentiate their product in some way or another, to move larger volume for that food at home sales really requires accessing a grocery store. But there are challenges accessing these grocery stores across the United States and really across the world. We've seen consolidation in almost every segment of our food system. The retail or grocery store segment is actually one of the least consolidated segments of the supply chain. But you should note here in this slide that if you look at that blue line, so these are the percent of sales by the top 4% of grocery stores of the United States. And so you can see that the top 4 grocery retailers in 2013 controlled about 40% of the market. So that's pretty significant. And I think what's also important to note is that each of these retailers has different ways that they want to purchase product or specialty crop products. So these retailers may be willing to purchase for a single store, but more frequently a store wants to buy for their chain, or at least be able to purchase for a number of the stores within a certain region. So that requires for a producer, in order to access those markets, that they're going to have consistent quality and quantity of product, which sometimes is difficult especially for smaller, mid-scale, or beginning producers to meet. So something to note. That is shifting a little bit as we've had these trends, as consumers are more interested in knowing where their food comes from, as we've had more consumer demand for these different source-identified products, that the retailers may be more willing to purchase for an individual store. But again, it's on a case-by-case basis. One thing that I think is really interesting to note, we hear lots in the mainstream media about the importance of consuming fruits and vegetables, but actually across sort of all demographics, consumption of vegetables has actually decreased. Now, most of that decrease, if we really break it down by specialty crop, most of that decrease is from potatoes, which is obviously unfortunate in a place like Colorado. We have a strong potato sector, but we have decreases across really all other vegetable commodities as well. So anyway, it's really important to note, but it's really also about how people are consuming these products. So, for example, if we look at fruits, and I didn't provide a slide here on this, we can see that juice consumption is actually dropping. So overall, there's an average of 385 pounds of fresh and processed vegetables per person available in the United States in 2014. And you can see that we're not eating close to that as Americans. So There may be some opportunities. I think that probably people who do work in nutrition education are sort of scratching their heads around this. That there's been so much money spent on these different kinds of educational opportunities. We have a huge expansion of farm to school, and we had a change in the nutrition standards. And so why is this actually decreasing? So we know that there's plenty of fruits and vegetables grown in this country, and we know that, so not only are there plenty of fruits and vegetables grown in this country, but we know that consumers in the U.S. are consuming a declining share. So what does that mean if you're trying to actually get into this market? Well, to me, it might mean that you need to think about how you're going to differentiate your product. So what are you going to do to make your product stand out from the lots of other products that are probably somewhat similar that are available in the marketplace? So there's many mechanisms to do this. One is certification. So certified organic is probably the most obvious, but there's lots of different certifications out there. I think certifications can actually have some challenges because now there's so many logos that are on different kinds of crops that I think consumers are a little bit confused about what some of these certifications mean. But that's certainly one option. One is identity preservation throughout the supply chain, so really marketing it as, in my case, Becca's Farm. I've got something up here about Cicada Family Farms. So a farm name that people know and they sort of trust it because it's somebody's farm. Another mechanism to do this is to talk about the geographic characteristics. So I'm sure we've all been eating lots of Palisade peaches this time of year, which are absolutely delicious. And we know that they can derive some kind of premium and are differentiated in the marketplace. The Colorado Department of Agriculture has their own branding initiative called Colorado Proud, another way to differentiate products. And indeed, we see some retailers that are actually having, this Colorado Proud label and logo in the grocery store. So lots of different mechanisms to do this. I thought I'd focus on organic sales for a minute because I think organic is pretty interesting for a number of reasons. But one is that it's been around for a while, so we actually have some pretty good information around what organic means in terms of retail trends, in terms of consumer willingness to pay a premium, and in terms of farm profitability. So U.S. organic food retail sales are increasing. The sales were $37 billion in 2015. Organic is still gaining ground in conventional supermarkets as well as at natural food markets, and is now accounting for about 15% of total U.S. food sales. So that's pretty significant. Fresh fruits and vegetables are the top-selling organic category, followed by dairy products. And organic farmers often earn a substantial price premium. So this is just showing you the growth in organic sales by category. And so you can see that fruit and vegetable does have some pretty substantial growth there. We had a record number of certified organic operations in the U.S. in 2014. We saw 5% growth, so we can still see that there are transitions. There are a number of programs that are available to support organic transitions in the United States, both at a state and federal level, because there are some costs involved with the transition. The transition itself takes about 3 years, and then there's costs actually associated with the certification and some additional input costs, some additional testing and such if you want to be certified organic. I thought I'd mention, too, that Colorado actually entered the top 8 organic sales in 2014. So we're now 8. But again, there's challenges in entering some of these markets. So it's not just about if your operation can become certified, but especially if you're not going to sell through one of those direct-to-consumer markets. And I guess I should have defined what a direct-to-consumer market is. It's where you're literally selling directly to your end customer who's going to eat the product. So that would be at a farmer's market or at a roadside stand. I'm guessing there's some people on the call who are familiar with CSAs, which is community-supported agriculture, where you actually buy a share of harvest from the farm. So if you're selling direct-to-consumer, there are potentially less of the supply chain logistics to figure out. But if you're going to certify organic and then you want to sell through what I would call an intermediated market, which is where there's some intermediary between the farm and the consumer, like a grocery store as an example, there may be other things you need to figure out. And one of those things is thinking about like the supply chain. Who is your distributor going to be? Are they going to be able to segregate the certified organic products? And I mentioned earlier that we've seen consolidation across all segments of the food system. The organic is no exception. And here's a chart that was put together by Phil Howard at Michigan State University, who does a lot of work on consolidation. And I just use this to point out that, you can see at the 80s, you have lots of different distributors, and there's been tremendous number of these acquisitions and mergers. Here's another slide showing the acquisitions and mergers that have taken place. So it means that there are fewer companies with which you can work in order to distribute your product, being certified organic, but again, organic is just not an exception. So I mentioned that we've seen tremendous growth and interest in local and regional food systems. These markets tend to have lower barriers to entry than other markets. And as a result, they've really been promoted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture, especially under the Obama administration, and that there's been a substantial additional resources available in the 2008 and 2014 Farm Bills. I'm guessing most people are aware of what the Farm Bill is, but essentially the Farm Bill is the major piece of legislation that controls funding for agriculture in this country. And it's generally passed about every 5 years, but depending on when Congress is able to get it through. So between 2009 and 2015, the Department of Agriculture invested over $1 billion in over 40,000 local and regional food businesses and infrastructure projects. The 2014 Farm Bill actually tripled the funding available for marketing and promotion of local and regional foods. And really, there's a lot of reasons for this. Part of the rationale that this administration gives around supporting rural economic development outcomes, but also it's really about that these markets have those lower barriers to entry. So if you're thinking about shifting the crops that you're going to grow, and you're just sort of starting out with something, you're going to start a new specialty crop, that it's a way to sort of test the market without investing a whole lot of money in additional capital equipment. And sometimes it takes a lot of effort to build some of those relationships with distributors or retailers, and this is a way you can start to build that customer base. So I just thought I'd provide a few of the examples of funding, especially if there are folks on this call who are thinking about shifting to specialty crop production or to different kinds of crops. It is good to know that there are a number of grants that are available. So there's actually funding for high tunnels that I think you heard Mark mention earlier. There's a Beginning and Farmer Rancher Development Program, Community Food Projects Awards, Farmers Market Promotion Program grants, specialty crop block grants. Those actually go in part through the Colorado Department of Agriculture, so it's a little bit easier to get those. And we've been fairly successful in bringing additional resources that way to the state. A certain amount allocated to every state based on their specialty crop sales, and then there's additional resources available. So in addition to the federal funding, there's also been a proliferation of state policies to support some of these markets. I just wanted to touch on really quickly that there is not a definition of local. So this is important because certification, when we talk about organic, brings additional costs with it. Because local doesn't actually have a definition, you can't be really certified local. So there's pros and cons of that, in my opinion. The pros are that you don't have those additional costs. The cons are that local is basically whatever the consumer thinks is local. So it can be, sometimes there's things marketed as local. There have been a few cases of this in the mainstream press that have come out recently where they're not actually local. And then different people view local differently. It comes down to, it's defined by the consumer. I would say increasingly the U.S. Department of Agriculture and in my research, moving to this market channel definition, so saying that somehow the source of the product, so that there's some kind of identity of the product that's maintained throughout the supply chain. So some examples would be farmers markets. You know who you're purchasing from regional food hubs, something else that have been heavily promoted by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. The idea here is that because there's been consolidation in every segment of the food system, it's harder for small and mid-scale producers to access some of these supply chains. So these food hubs aggregate product from a number of different, normally small and mid-scale producers, number of different sources, although they also work with larger scale producers. And then together, working together as a hub, they work to access some of these mainstream markets like institutions, school districts, retailers, et cetera. And we've also seen growth in school districts with farm-to-school programs. So these are three examples where the source of the product is maintained throughout the supply chain. And again, we've seen tremendous growth in each of these since 2007. We also have seen growth in farmers markets, over a 2% increase. And you can see that in the northern Colorado Front Range, indeed, we have a hotspot of these farmers markets. I will say, though, that just because we see net growth, it sort of obscures the fact that some farmers markets don't do very well. So we have some farmers markets that fail. I'll show a slide that'll point to this more in a second, but what we see in general is that those urban markets tend to do better than rural markets, which really makes sense because there are more people to buy product in those urban markets and those urban environments. But certainly something to consider if you're thinking about transitioning to different kinds of crops and thinking about the market opportunities that are available. I think it's one of the reasons we see a number of these producers on the West Slope with their Palisade peaches that are actually trucking the peaches over to these markets on the Front Range. So in terms of direct-to-consumer farms and sales, we've seen pretty steady growth in both the number of farms with direct-to-consumer sales as well as the total sales, although that number, the total sales number, is really starting to plateau. So we see that both growth in farmers markets appears to be waning. That doesn't seem to be true yet in Colorado, but I've done work in the Northeast for the past 10 years before moving here, and I'll say that, I think the Northeast is slightly ahead of where Colorado is in terms of some of these local food markets, and we are seeing plateauing there. So I would expect that those are the trends we'll start to see here in Colorado. The number of CSAs, the community-supported agricultures that I mentioned, grew by 11% in the West from 2007 to 2012. But again, in the U.S., the growth was at about 1%. So even though we do see growth in Colorado, again, I would expect that these markets are starting to get saturated. So really thinking about what would you be doing as a CSA that's different from what already exists out there. Overall, in 2012, it was almost 8% of all farms that were using these local market channels, representing about $6.2 billion in total sales in 2012. I will say, as a researcher, the data in this space has not been very good, but it's about to shift pretty dramatically as the USDA National Agriculture Statistics Service is for the first time doing a local food survey. Last time I heard they had already over 17,000 respondents, so it's pretty exciting about what we'll be able to look at once that comes out. I also want to highlight here that what we see, because we're seeing these direct-to-consumer sales start to plateau, we're seeing growth in these intermediated market sales. So again, sales to restaurants. It makes sense if you think about those earlier slides showing that so much more of the U.S. consumers' food dollars are spent at grocery stores. Why would see growth in those places? Also, what I wanted you to take away from this slide is that though the majority of farms that are selling through these channels are smaller scale, the majority of sales through these channels tend to be larger operations. So we do see growth in these intermediated channels. Farm to school is a great example. We have, according to the recent Farm to School census, 42% of school districts that are now participating in some kind of farm to school where they're generally doing some kind of local procurement. But it's important to note that accessing schools is very complicated. Our school districts are heavily regulated in their meals, as they should be. We don't want our students to get sick. We want to make sure we've got a safe supply of food that's going into our schools. And then also there's not a lot of money available for schools to spend per meal. And so it's harder for certain kinds of farms, especially smaller mid-scale producers, to access some of these markets. So it's just important to note that, yes, there's growth in intermediate markets. There's certainly market opportunities that are available there, but sort of right-sizing your operation, your scale of production, what you're going to be doing with some market opportunity is really important to think about on the front end. So I'm going to end by talking about just a very quick snapshot of what we know about the farm profitability impacts of these of sales through these different kinds of markets. And this is where I spend a lot of time doing research. And if any of you have any questions, I'd be happy to talk about this in greater length. So information about average retail prices per pound and per crop equivalents, that information is readily collected and available through the USDA Economic Research Service. So if you want to get a sense, I encourage you to go onto the website. You see here different prices for fresh and canned and frozen. And then we also are starting to have more information that's available looking at price premiums based on certain kinds of differentiation. So here we see organic price premiums in 2010 for certain kinds of products. So the prices for fresh fruits and vegetables had the most variability between 2004 and 2010, with premiums ranging between 7 and 60% of the non-organic price of each product. Additionally, the USDA is also collecting information and making it available on some of these more alternative markets. One of my colleagues at CSU, Martha Sullins, is actually putting together some of these farmers market price reports. There's farm stand reports and a number of others. So you can actually go on there and get information weekly about how other producers are pricing their product and how that the price of that product compares to retail prices or other kinds of like terminal markets or other things. I think for the sake of time, I'm actually going to skip those slides, but please return to them if you'd like. The thing that is important to keep in mind is that product differentiation comes with additional input costs. So just because you get that premium, there's also generally additional input expenditures that need to be kept in mind. And one of those input costs, and I would say the largest input cost when you're looking especially at some of these local and regional food markets, is skilled labor. So this is some work that I've been doing with colleagues here at CSU, Ali Bauman and Don Filmony McFadden, looking at expenditure patterns for U.S. farms, those that do not use local food markets compared to those who do. Those that don't are on the top and those that do are underneath. And I have this broken down many ways. I just wanted to make the point that you can see for farms that are selling through local markets, labor is the largest share of total expenditure compared to farms that are not utilizing those local markets where that's not the case. And if you think about this intuitively, it really makes sense, right? If you are selling through these local markets, you're essentially taking on additional supply chain functions. You're doing more of your own marketing or processing or distribution. You're sitting at a farmer's market for a number of hours. All of that requires labor, and labor is a substantial additional cost that you really want to think about at the front end. So this is some work that I've been doing with a colleague, Steve Vogel, who's at the Economic Research Service. And what we see here is that for small-scale producers, so those under $350,000 in sales, and this is gross sales, gross cash farm income, we see that there does seem to be some benefit to participating in these local and regional food markets. So we see that under $350,000, that the farms, local food producers have lower operating expense ratios. So that means that they reach a break-even point more quickly. And we also see that they're more likely to earn positive profits. However, those trends seem to reverse once an operation gets over $350,000 in sales. If we look at survivability data, the definition of this is a farm business is considered to survive if its operator reported positive sales in consecutive censuses. So that would be 2007 and 2012. And what we can see here, on the left column, you're looking at farms without direct sales. In the right column, you're looking at farms that do have direct sales. And you can see across all sales categories that there seems to be a benefit. The farm is more likely to have survived if they participated in some of these local markets. The story is mixed when we actually look at the change in the size of the operation, and so we see that there's more mixed results there. So sort of mixed profitability impacts of market channel selection, local food markets in this case. So we're actually doing a project here in Colorado with the Colorado Department of Agriculture. It's funded through a USDA Ag Marketing Service Federal State Marketing Improvement Program grant, where we're actually trying to do market channel assessments with specialty crop producers across the state. So this is not results from work that we did in Colorado. This is some colleagues who did this work at Cornell University earlier. But we're really trying to get a sense of, where are the top performing farms in terms of their sales per labor hour. So, sort of get a sense of return on investment per labor hour expenditure. And we're also trying to calculate for these farms which of these markets are most profitable. I think that there's been this mentality, in part because there just hasn't been enough evidence that, if we sell at a farmer's market, if we produce salsa, if we do these different kinds of diversification strategies, that there's a market there because we know that there's increasing consumer demand for local and regional food products. Well, that's not always the case. And so really doing that market research ahead of time and understanding, what your costs of production are and what your markets are is really important before you get started. So this is what I mentioned earlier, that we know that the value of farm direct-to-consumer sales is greatest in highly urban areas. We can see in Colorado that farms with direct sales are concentrated in metro areas. Farmers markets are concentrated in metro areas. So this is also something to really think about when you're trying to choose your market. If you're located in a really rural space, you may have to think about maybe not using a direct market. Maybe you want to try to access an intermediated market, but what kind of supply chain infrastructure actually exists for you? In addition, there are changing regulations. The Food Safety Modernization Act was passed in 2011, but the regulations have just been finalized. It's the most sweeping reform of food safety laws in more than 70 years. And so it's going to affect specialty crop producers. And so that's something else that you want to really think about. So just to end here, before you really get started and even thinking about shifting what you're doing or starting an operation, you want to think about what is your operation's comparative advantage. Are you located close to an urban center with consumers that already have heard of your farm and would be eager to purchase products from you at a farmer's market? Are you located in Palisades and you have the land that's great for growing peaches, and so you're going to derive a premium by marketing as Palisade peaches? What are the market opportunities? What value-added or supply chain infrastructure is available? Can you do processing? A lot of times farms try to make those capital investments right off the bat. Sometimes it's better to actually use infrastructure that's already available for you. There are rising input costs. It's well documented. As I mentioned, labor is a huge one of those. Do you have access to farm labor? We have real challenges getting farm labor in this country. And then there's additional regulatory requirements based on market or certification, especially those export markets. So I apologize for talking so fast and throwing so much information at you, but I just wanted to provide some food for thought about some of these challenges that you want to consider. There's certainly opportunities as well, but things you really want to think through before you make some kind of investment to shift what you're doing.
Okay, thank you very much, Becca. That was very comprehensive. Did a great job in the limited amount of time. And I want to just sort of open it up, Margaret. I know that certainly got into the question you had. I don't know if you have some follow-up on that, but we can open it. We got about 5 minutes here. We can open it up to some questions.
Well, this is Margaret. One follow-up question. Thank you. That was super interesting and helpful. I was curious if, Becca, you've done any analysis of alternative fiber crops that may be water savings and may have markets. It's a very different marketing approach, but I was curious if there had been any analysis on that.
I have not done any analysis on that. I know that there's a bunch of work that's starting to happen at CSU that's looking at hemp as an example. although I really don't know anything about water requirements for crops. But that's something certainly that we could look at, some of the market opportunities here. So, yeah, I'd be interested in chatting about it and seeing potential research opportunities and opportunities for collaboration.
Margaret, this is Perry. We actually do have at our Southeastern Colorado Research Center, which is down in Yellow Jacket, and at our Fruta Research Center in Grand Junction, we have two, I wouldn't call them variety trials, but we are growing hemp at those locations, largely just as a sort of proof of concept. How do you grow this stuff? And I would like and probably will push for further examination of water consumption as well. A lot of the people in the southeastern part of the state really want to get into seed production of hemp, not just growing the hemp itself.
Interesting. Thanks.
Yeah, so maybe in next year or whenever we put out our next report, it's kind of a dicey issue. It turns out when you're growing hemp with federal water, which we have in one of our cases, you know, and many places have that issue where federal water cannot be used to grow this crop, and so it's kind of it's kind of touchy for like the Grand Valley. Becca, quick, could you, when you do the add this to, or whenever Aaron puts up the PowerPoint or whatever, could you just provide the link for that Journey of Fruits and Veggies website for the CDA? I don't know if it was on the slide, but that's a pretty cool link.
Yes, absolutely, and I have them all included in the notes as well.
Oh, perfect.
Great. Any final questions or comments for?
I just want to summarize one thing real quick. Is that so, Becca? I mean, everything you've kind of covered is. I mean, I used to think watersheds were complicated, and food sheds involve a whole other level of complexity that I have a hard time getting my head around. But one of the challenges of the west slope of Colorado is obviously this sort of distance to market, and we don't have a massive metropolitan center. I mean, this is something to consider as we do our work together. But what would you say is sort of the what advice would you have, or how would you even want to begin the discussion with your average Grand Valley farmer about how they might what they might look at for a crop? We see a lot of people out here doing hops. I mean, from your vantage point, does anything look Colorado specific, Colorado unique, a way that the west slope could jump into some of these markets? That's a huge question, but what's your, I guess, general sentiment about that?
Well, I mean, I guess I would answer that, but I wouldn't start by saying, okay, what crop do I think there's a market for? Because I think there's a lot of market opportunities out there. I'm seeing some people on the west slope do some interesting things, like talking to some of the larger growers, right, that already have an in with some of these retailers and saying, hey, can I grow one crop for you, right, so that they can reduce their cost of production because they're really specializing in one crop that they think they can do well, and they're basically going to have this neighboring farm market it for them. Now, they can diversify beyond that, but at least that gets them started. They're going to have a better sense of what the price is, what the input costs are, as a way to get off the ground, sort of risk mitigation. There's a number of these food hubs that are getting off the ground as well, and that they're trying to look at some of these kind of innovative, differentiated market opportunities. So I think, going and talking to the market before you get going is a really good place to start. Because then you can do your research about, well, do I think I can grow that crop well or not? I think the harder piece, at least from my perspective, and I'm probably biased as an economist, is thinking about, what is there a market for that is going to be sort of the least risky when I get started?
Yeah, I think the value of that kind of coordinated effort it cannot be overstated. We could use more of that here. Okay, well, Aaron, I'll turn it back to you, and thanks again, everybody, for joining us for the series. This has been a really good one.
Yeah, thanks, Perry, and thanks again to Becca and to Mark, and definitely look forward to continuing the conversation around crop switching, crop conversion. I think Mark said it best, saying this is just the start of the conversation. So I will send out the recording and slides from Mark and Becca, and encourage anybody to follow up with them directly or talk with myself or Perry that are pushing some of this work forward as well. So it's a little after 2, but thanks again for joining, and forward to talking with you all again soon. Have a great afternoon.
Take care, folks.